Okay, so now you have your student resource guide, and I'm going to take you through and give you the notes for the first set of notes called Mendel's Genetics. So you have the guide here, and I have the presentation I'm going to be pulling up, and we're going to be going through together. We're not going to do a Nearpod for this one. It's just going to be a straight up notes. Miss Stanley can pause this to give you more time. Also, the notes are posted on Schoology, not filling in the guide, but the actual notes that I'm using to give you. And so I'm going to pull those up, and you are using that in your student guide. So everyone needs to have this out and open to student guide notes number 1. All right, so Mendel's genetics. So this is going to be the setup for what we're going to be studying for like the next 4 or 5 weeks. And this is the topic of genetics or heredity. And what I like to tell students is that genetics is kind of like a foreign language. So there's going to be words that you're just going to have to be able to understand to apply it. Words like allele, homozygous, heterozygous, purebred, gene, chromosome, phenotype, genotype. These words, when you hear them, you're just going to have to get to the point where you just know what it means so that you can apply it to your understanding. So we spend a lot of time talking about vocabulary and practicing vocabulary. So that's going to be really important at the beginning of the unit. And so Mendel's genetics, this is Gregor Mendel. We've talked about him before. He is considered the father of genetics. And we talked about him when we learned about chromosomes and DNA. And he has some really important background as far as our understanding of genetics and DNA in general. So the first word that I want us to kind of look at is heredity. So this is just the passing on of physical characteristics to offspring. And then we have the word trait. Okay, trait is each different form of a particular characteristic. So an example is if the characteristic is height, then the different forms of height are short and tall. Okay, this is the trait, like the tall gene or the short gene. Now, height in humans is much more complicated than this. This is why we are going to talk a lot about plants when we first learn about genetics, because this is what Gregor Mendel studied. And again, if I'm going too quickly, then Miss Stanley just pauses it. Mendel's genetics. So he's considered the father of genetics, and he just simply had a garden. He was not a scientist. Actually, I believe he was a monk, and he liked to garden, and he started just to make observations of pea plants. And he just had the natural course of scientific inquiry. Those observations led him to ask questions. And so he did not mean to set up this big scientific experiment. This was just in his own hobbies in his day-to-day life, which is just pretty cool. And so his questions led him to cross plants with different traits. So remember, a trait is a different form or characteristic. So a trait of height, or possibly seed shape, or flower color. These are all examples of traits. And so the first trait that he studied was height. And so he crossed a tall plant with a short plant. And so I want you just to think about, without any prior knowledge of genetics and traits and things like that, if you take a tall plant and you cross it with a short plant, what do you think the offspring is going to be? Think about it for a second. I bet most of you probably say medium. It's going to be somewhere in between. And this is what he thought would happen as well. So he thought crossing a tall plant with a short plant would give you a medium-sized plant. All right, so what were his results? So first of all, when you're following kind of a trait through generations, it's kind of in this chart. It's called you can call it like a pedigree type of thing, and you're following traits. And so when you're looking at a particular trait, the first generation, they call it the P generation, the parents of that trait. And then their offspring are called the F1, and the next one is called the F2. And you can keep going like that for as many generations as you want to actually follow a particular trait. And you know a little bit about flower reproduction. So there are no male and female flowers. Flowers have all that they need, male and female parts. We've talked about how pollen is like the sperm of plants. And I know in Miss Verrett's class in 5th grade, you talked about some of the other parts. And so when the F1, pollinates, then their offspring are the F2. And so what he did is he decided to cross them. So sometimes, probably like you can think about this like dog breeding, when you take a particular breed of dog and you breed them with another breed to get a desired result. And so he took like the male part of one plant and the female part of another plant and made them reproduce just by putting the pollen, with the different parts of the female portion of the plant. So it was like an intentional breeding. And so he noticed that only one form of the trait appeared in the F1 generation, but the other form reappeared in the F2 generation, which was the short. So when he took the tall plant and the short plant, they weren't medium height. They were all tall. Now, this was not what he was expecting, which would naturally lead him to ask more additional questions. Well, why were they not in between? That didn't seem to make sense. It was really against the current understanding of heredity in that day. And so he decided, well, I'm going to take the F1 generation and cross two of them and see what happens. And what happened is that the short trait reappeared. Again, not what he expected to happen. And so you may have heard of a trait, quote unquote, skipping a generation. Maybe your parents have said that sort of in jest on certain things, but this is true in some traits. So, for example, I don't know, do we have any redheads in seventh grade? But this is typically a trait, red hair, that tends to skip a generation. Not always, but if you find a true person who is a redhead and ask them, do either of your parents have red hair? Most of the time, the answer is no. It's usually a grandparent or a great uncle or a great aunt. It seems to skip generations. This is not all the time, but sometimes. And so this can happen. And so this led to his discovery. Oh, here's a little picture, okay, of what's going on here. So you can see that, and we're going to talk about what all these T's mean here in a second. You got big T's and little T's. This is all how we follow traits, okay? So this is his tall plant and his short plant. He crossed them and he got all tall. And so he decided to cross these two tall plants. And in the next generation, the short trait showed back up. Okay, and this was not what he was expecting. And so this led him to a huge discovery of what's called dominant and recessive traits. So his results led to the idea of traits being dominant or recessive. And he concluded that these factors actually exist in pairs. And you have to understand that the term gene had not yet been identified. So we did not even know about chromosomes. We didn't know about genes. He was able to determine that you get one factor from the male parent and one factor from the female parent, and some factors tend to hide them. So we already know this because I told you that when sperm met egg, half your genetic information from mom, half from dad. It's through the chromosomes, 46 total, 23 pairs. He had no knowledge of this. And so in just understanding this is how he came to this realization. And he realized that some factors seem to hide others. So genes are factors that control our traits, and an allele is a different form of a gene. Here's where that vocabulary comes in. You're going to be like, Miss Barnett, gene, allele. You really have to practice with this. And probably the way that I'm going to have you be practicing is just with playing and playing and playing some gym kits, and just repetition and practice with these terms. But you can't just sit there, if you go in a foreign language class and don't know some of the basics of the language, you're really going to be lost. It's very true for genetics as well. And so he understood that each organism actually inherits two alleles from its parents, one from mom, one from dad. So let's give the example of the height, okay? So in the stems, like the stem height of the plants. So in any of those scenarios, you either inherit two alleles of the tall stem. And the way that we represent that is with big T's, big T, big T. Two alleles of the short stem, like little t, or one of each, which would be big T, little t. So the traits you have are controlled by the alleles you inherit. So if you inherit a dominant allele, this is one whose trait always shows up when present. So tallness in plants is dominant. It is going to hide or mask any other allele that you have. The recessive allele is hidden. It doesn't mean it goes away. It's there. It's just not expressed in the offspring because it's hidden whenever a dominant allele is present. So shortness in plants was recessive. It was hidden in that F1 generation. It showed back up in the F2, but for the F1 generation, it was hidden. So the way that we kind of keep track of this on paper is through capital and lowercase letters. And you don't always have to use T's. I just happen to use T's in this first set of notes. You can actually use any letter you want. But if you want to represent the dominant form of the allele, you are always going to use a capital letter. And the recessive form of an allele will always be the lowercase letter. So for the height characteristic, the big T would be a tall plant and the little t would be the short plant. So you have some scenarios here of different things that you can inherit. If you remember, you always inherit two, and how they pair together is what determines your trait. So if you inherit two dominant alleles, it is always written as big T, or whatever letters you're choosing. And this is a situation called homozygous dominant. So homozygous literally means homo means the same. So means you got two of the same dominant alleles. If you inherit two recessive, you write it as little t, and this is the opposite. This is homozygous recessive. So this is homozygous, meaning two of the same alleles both happen to be recessive. Or you can inherit one of each. And you would represent that by big T, little t, and this is called heterozygous because hetero means different, which means you inherit different alleles. So in summary, Mendel's discoveries really changed the idea of how we understood inheritance, and he really led eventually to the discovery of the structure of DNA. Before Mendel, the common understanding was if you had a tall plant and you crossed it with a short plant, the expected outcome would be a medium-sized plant. But after Mendel, we realized this is not always the case because of dominant and recessive alleles. So that's the first set of notes. And we're now going to do an assignment where we're kind of going to be looking at this a little bit more. We're going to be using the textbook. As I told you, this all goes with one full chapter in your textbook. So it's going to be a resource that we use for genetics. And so we're going to be working with some of these notes.